Siobhan, and I am a writer, but first of all, I work for Historic Royal Palaces. That's the main thing that I do, and I have worked for them for 20 years.
That's right. Siobhan Clarke of Historic Royal Palaces is with us today to talk about that famous palace and prison, the Tower of London. I want to thank you, Siobhan Clarke, for joining us today on the podcast and for taking us through some of the maybe lesser known but really exciting stories of rebels at the Tower of London and maybe some of the other places in England that rebels hung out. So I know the Tower's a big place. So can we just start by asking, what are some of your favorite stories about rebels at the Tower of London?
Okay. Well, I think that it's quite interesting to look at the time of Elizabeth I. You see, the Tower really became known as a prison in the reign of Henry VIII, but the people that he was imprisoning weren't really rebels. They were people that he fell out with politically, essentially, and political and religious prisoners rather than rebels as such. In Elizabeth's reign, you could say that they were rebels because the sort of people that she imprisoned were Catholics, and they were people who, or certainly who the Elizabethan regime believed to be rebels, in that they thought that these people wanted to undermine the regime, and worst of all, they thought that they were trying to kill Elizabeth, particularly Jesuits. It was actually illegal for a Catholic priest to enter England, so just by coming into the country, they were breaking the law. So they had to come in undercover. They had to live like spies and, go to secret houses where they would find refuge. There were hiding places for priests, and it was all very clandestine, etc., etc. So when they were caught, it was very serious. Majority were executed. And one of my favourite stories is about a Jesuit called John Jarrod, who in 1597 did something rather remarkable, because he actually managed to escape from the Tower of London, which very few people do. And he's also very interesting because he lived a long life. He came over to England several times undercover, and lived in this cloak and dagger world of Elizabethan clandestine activity. But despite being caught, as I say, he did escape, and he lived to be an old man, and wrote his memoirs. So you can actually read it from his own words of what happened to him. And he describes being tortured in the Tower of London, and the way that they tortured him was with the manacles, which meant that they hung him up by his wrists. With all of his weight, hanging from his wrists. And he didn't give away any secrets, but his hands were so swollen and so sore. He made friends with one of his jailers, and he asked for oranges, because he said that he was using the oranges to sort of practice getting the feeling back into his hands by squeezing these oranges. But what he was really doing was he was using the juice to make secret invisible ink, which he then smuggled out to friends, and was able to organise a rescue. And the form that it took was John Jarrod was in the Cradle Tower. So the Tower of London is made up of lots of different towers, and some are more secure than others. And the Cradle Tower was near the Thames, so it's right near the river. And he was able to communicate with people outside who organised a boat. And he also managed to get hold of rope, incredibly, and he escaped from the roof of the cradle tower. And by using rope and getting down onto the wharf and having a boat there was very important to make his escape. And even though his hands and wrists were still very sore, he managed to get himself down on this rope. And he escaped. So it's an interesting story because not very few people did actually escape from the Tower of London. And ultimately, as a Jesuit, he would probably have been hung, drawn, and quartered if he hadn't made that daring escape.
That is such a wonderful story and one of my favorites. I do just love that. And the last time I was at the tower, there was a little set up of his cell, and on the desk there were a couple of oranges. Is that still there? Because that's a really wonderful place for people to visit. I don't know if it was his actual cell, but it's set up as if it's his cell and he's about to escape, and you can
Oh,
see.
that's interesting. No, I don't remember seeing that, but it's certainly a good idea. Children especially love that
Yes.
kind of thing. Yeah, yeah.
Yes. And that is such a wonderful story. And he did go on to, fame in his time. But I also will tell you that Time magazine here in the States did a special edition on the top 10 prison escapes of all time. And John Jarrod, his escape did make that list in Time magazine. So I thought that was pretty
Wow.
spectacular. Yes. So he's
Oh,
gone
yeah.
down in history. I'll send you that link, Siobhan.
Oh,
But
yeah.
yes, so
Okay.
it was a bit ago, but it is a really wonderful story, and so he is sort of known for that. So I do
Yeah.
love that, and that really shows the combination, for him at least, of the idea of being a priest and being a spy, because he's using his beliefs, but also some spy techniques like secret writing and smuggling out letters and messages. So he's great.
Completely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
They did actually behave like spies, which is why the government treated them, in the way that they did. They really thought they were dangerous.
Right. Well, and you can see if somebody can escape from the tower, that's a pretty dramatic act. So
Yeah, yeah. He
that's
was quite
great.
clever. Mm.
Yes. And that's a great story to get us started. Are there maybe some lesser known people
Yeah.
that don't make the headlines? Tell us about some of them, because I think their stories are important too and really
Well,
fun.
one of my the one that I find the most fascinating is Flora Macdonald, because people may have heard of her if they know anything about Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite Rising of 1745, and how Prince Charlie, Charles Stuart, he tries to get the throne back for his father, for the Jacobites, and he's defeated at Culloden and goes on the run. And this young woman, Flora, she helps him escape over to Skye, which is an island in the Highlands, and not people maybe have heard of her name in that connotation. It's a very romantic story, and it's a true story. She really did help him to escape. Anyway, Flora was later arrested, and she was actually taken to the Tower of London, Flora Macdonald, and held there. But they didn't do anything too drastic to Flora, because there was a lot of public sympathy, actually. I think because it was such a romantic story. And she became something of a celebrity. People wanted to come and visit her in the tower. And she even had her portrait painted when she was there. And that portrait hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. So she is, I think, is a very interesting prisoner, and someone that people maybe don't know about, because she wasn't executed. They were actually quite lenient with her. She was eventually released, but that wasn't the end of her adventures, because she emigrated to North Carolina, and she ended up getting mixed up in the American Revolution later on, and had lots of adventures, and then finally, after various escapades and adventures, she returned to Skye. She came back to Scotland, where she died in 1790. So she had a very interesting life, and she's definitely one of the lesser known prisoners of the Tower of London.
Well, that's really interesting. And I'm not familiar with her. So that's a great example. Yes, of someone who has her own story, and her time in the tower is a part of that, but not the whole story. So there's this whole after story. That's great. And I didn't know all
Yeah.
those things. That's
Mm.
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned that from the time of Elizabeth, it becomes more of a well. Henry VIII started it as a prison,
Yeah.
or it becomes really known as a prison, and then through Elizabeth's reign and into the Stuarts, of course, and all of that. So, if you were at that time in the Tudor Stuart era a prisoner in the tower,
Yeah.
what would your life be like? And I know there's a range. So can you talk us through sort of the range? Not everyone had the same experience,
That's
even
right.
if they were a prisoner.
Yeah. So the first thing to say is that the Tower's role as a prison is just completely incidental. I mean, was never its main purpose. It was a royal palace. It was a fortress. It was a place of safety for the royal family, and it kind of became a prison really sort of by accident. You know, Henry VIII was just putting political prisoners there, high level people like Sir Thomas More. Thomas Cromwell, those sorts of people. Now, the way that you're treated depends what the king wants from you. So, Thomas More was put in a very bare cell, and his cell actually still exists. I'm afraid the public can't get in to see it because it's too fragile. But it does exist, and it is very sort of cold and bare and gloomy, and he didn't have furniture and tapestries and comfortable things in there because the king didn't want him to be comfortable. Henry wanted Thomas More to capitulate, to agree to the Act of Supremacy, to take the oath of the Act of Supremacy, to agree to Henry being head of the church. So he's trying to break him, essentially. But where there's a situation where the monarch isn't trying to bend someone to their will, if it's just a case of they're putting someone in there because they just want to keep them confined, it can be quite comfortable. So a really good example is Sir Walter Raleigh. So he's put there by James I in the early 1600s. And he was there for a very long time, actually. But his life was quite comfortable. And if you had money, you could bring in furniture and tapestries, you could have servants, you could have nice food, providing you're able to pay for it. And this is the point. In England at the time, when they put people in prison, they didn't see why they should have to feed these people. So in common prisons like the Clink or the Fleet or Newgate, life was horrendous because there was so much disease and you starved unless you had friends on the outside who would bring you food. You could just starve. That your jailers will not feed you. So actually being a prisoner in the Tower was better than being a prisoner in the common prisons, and it could be very comfortable, providing you had the money to pay for everything, and providing the king isn't trying to get you to bend to his will. You can live in some comfort, and there was no purpose-built cells or prisons within the Tower complex. They just housed people wherever they had space. So you find prisoners dotted around in various towers and various sort of rooms. There's no dungeons as such. That's all a bit of a myth.
But I know it was also considered the place where the monarch would spend a night or two before the coronation. Is
Yes,
that because of its association as a stronghold and the
yes,
royal palace? Okay.
yeah, and it's symbolic because
Mm-hmm.
holding the tower, having possession of the tower is symbolic. It's showing that you really have taken over. You know, you are the new monarch. You've taken possession of the Tower of London. So that's correct. They would stay there the night before.
Okay.
But the last one to do that would have been Charles the First. Charles the Second, when he became king, when he was restored in 1660, his coronation was in 1661, and the royal apartments were in such a bad state by then he couldn't stay there. But he rode there and started his procession from the Tower of London on the morning of his coronation.
That's great. And it also reminds me of one of the characters, one of the tragic characters, whose reign plays out in the Tower is Lady Jane Grey, who's
Mm,
set up there as queen and in that same building ends up as a prisoner. So
yeah.
within the Tower complex. So that just reminds us of all the things that by that point in the Tudor reign, it was still a royal apartment, but so she was there. But then once they took down her canopy of state, then she was considered a prisoner in that
Yes.
same space.
And she was moved, actually. She was moved.
Right.
She was moved out of the royal apartments and she was moved to Tower Green
Okay.
an apartment there. But she was still kept in comfort. She wasn't put in a cell or anything. But she was moved out of the royal apartments once
Okay.
she was
Because
deposed. Yeah.
once Mary was declared queen. Okay.
Yeah.
So that I think that's also a nice reminder of us of all of the complexity of that space. I know you do a lot of lectures about the Tower. Can you tell us some of your favorite things or favorite stories or what surprises people to hear about the Tower?
Yeah.
Most of us
Yeah.
sort of think of it as a prison, but tell us some
Yeah.
of the other bits.
Well, this is it. I enjoy explaining to people that it's not as gloomy as you might think. This bad reputation it comes from when the little princes disappeared in the reign of Richard III. That's when that first gloomy thing comes over the Tower of London, the princes in the Tower, and then all the prisoners through Henry VIII's reign and Elizabeth's reign, and the priests being tortured. And people even today, I'm afraid, tourists come to Tower of London and they think it's mainly about executions and prisoners, and it's just so not. And there was actually very little torture between 1540 and 1640. So in that 100-year period, which is the main period for prisoners, there were only 48 cases of torture because it had to be approved by the Privy Council. So we know that it wasn't as much as people might think. It's all been exaggerated by mainly by 19th century writers, actually, and also by the yeoman warders, because they started doing tours in the 19th century, and they emphasised all the drama, the blood, they really piled it on, and it got more and more of this reputation. Whereas I like to focus on the medieval palace, which was very beautiful, very colourful. I think other aspects are interesting, like the menagerie, all the animals that were kept there. Of course, there's the crown jewels. So there's lots of really nice aspects to the Tower of London. But the other thing I'd like to mention is that some people come and everybody comes knowing about Anne Boleyn, and most people know that Elizabeth I was prisoner as a princess. People sort of know about Lady Jane Grey, so they do tend to know about the really famous prisoners. But not a lot of Americans know that we actually had an American prisoner in the Tower of London. Did you know that Henry Lawrence was a prisoner?
I knew he spent some time there.
Yes. In fact, he's the only American prisoner that we've held. So that was in 1780. And he was arrested because a British frigate intercepted his ship. He was on his way to Holland to try and agree a draft with the Dutch, to get support for the American Revolution. And a British frigate intercepted his ship, and they found papers, and they had plenty of evidence against him, and as far as they were concerned, he was a traitor. So when they brought him back to London, they took him to the Tower, and he wrote later in his memoirs about how they housed him near Tower Green, in buildings which you can still see today. And he wrote in his memoirs about them playing Yankee Doodle Dandy outside, meaning that they were doing it to be derisive. But he said that he was actually much comforted by hearing it. And he actually didn't have great conditions, because they were trying to get him to give them information. So there were bars on the window, and he was also told that he had to pay for everything, which he was quite dismayed about. Even on one occasion, they asked him to pay the wages of his guards. It's quite funny because he writes about how, I don't see why I should pay my guards. As far as I'm concerned, they can go away. I don't need them to be here. It's all really, really interesting. But such was at the time, they couldn't really execute him. It would have just caused, too much of a diplomatic incident. So, excuse me. So they just kept him prisoner, and then he was eventually exchanged. There was a prisoner exchange after the British defeat at Yorktown. General Cornwallis, of course, surrendered, and he was exchanged for Henry Lawrence. But he's the father of John Lawrence, who was a really good friend of Alexander Hamilton.
Right. And many of us in Hamilton got to know John Lawrence through Hamilton. So, right. Yes.
Yeah. So I think I find that to be an interesting story.
I understand now that the tower is one of the absolute most visited destinations in England. When did it become such a tourist or such a fascinating place for people to want to visit and see?
Well, in a sense, it's all. Funnily, you might be surprised by this, but it's always been a tourist destination because they had the menagerie there. You see, the menagerie stemmed from the practice of medieval kings sending each other animals, like lions and leopards and that kind of thing, as gifts. And our medieval kings were sent lions. The King of Norway sent a polar bear. The King of France sent an elephant to Henry III. And these animals were kept in the Tower of London. And over the centuries, the collection just grew. And so ordinary people would come to the Tower of London to come and see this menagerie. So it was quite famous for that. And in the Elizabethan period, there are tourists who talk about coming to London and going to the Tower of London. So, but it wasn't on such a massive scale as it is now. So it really took off in the sense that we know it today in the 19th century. From 1838, Queen Victoria comes to the throne and she opens Hampton Court Palace. Throws it open to all her subjects, and they don't even have to pay. It's free to come to the gardens, see the palace. And she says the same for the Tower of London, that ordinary people are welcome, the public can come in. And as I mentioned earlier, the yeoman warders, they start doing tours and they start telling all these stories, and it really takes off. And plus, there's a Gothic revival at the time in the 19th century, and the Victorians really start to get interested in castles and armour and all the various artefacts, and they do a lot to preserve the tower. They spend a lot of money on it, repairing it, preserving it. And then they do start charging. The menagerie gets moved. It gets moved to Regent's Park and becomes London Zoo. And they turn some of the old animal cages into a ticket booth, and they start selling tickets and guidebooks. And then it just takes off from there. And today it's a World Heritage Site. It's one of the most visited places in the world. And for historical palaces, the tower is very important to us because it makes more money than all the other palaces put together. And it kind of, in a way, it kind of subsidizes some of the other palaces. So it's very important. It's a big, big attraction.
Now, I do want to just transition a little bit because I know you have something very exciting that you and I've talked about a little bit, which is a book coming out next year. And so can you tell us a little bit about that? And what it's about, and you have a number of books out, and we'll talk about all of them, but I really want to know about this new one coming out. So tell us a bit.
Well, the background to it is that I wrote a book called King and Collector, Henry VIII and the Art of Kingship, which is about Henry as an art collector and telling his life through his art. And then our publisher, I do it with Linda Collins, who's an art historian. Our publisher said, well, why not do one about Elizabeth? And we thought, yeah, great idea. Because actually, it was Alison Weir yes, it was Alison's idea, first of all. Alison said we should do Elizabeth, and our publisher really liked the idea. And we thought, great. So Elizabeth's image was so important, so fundamental to her queenship. And the book is really, it's telling her story, which is obviously it's been done many times before, but in a different way, telling her story through the art, through the different images of Elizabeth, from the young princess all the way through to Gloriana, and how she changes, which you can see very clearly by looking at the paintings, how her image changes as her reign progresses, and looking at artists of the period, particularly Nicholas Hilliard, who was a great miniaturist. And it's when England finally, through Hilliard, England finally on the European stage can say, we're just as good as European artists. It's not till we get to Hilliard that we find that. Prior to him, England was really lagging behind the rest of Europe and very much considered a cultural backwater. So that's quite interesting. So that happens in Elizabeth's reign. And also, the book covers the idea of the golden age, the exploration and obviously the Elizabethan stage. It was just a complete flowering of age. And that's a lot to do with Elizabeth herself, because her long reign provided peace and stability, which the arts need to flourish. And also she promoted so many of these arts. So it's covering things like that, yeah. And we do also look at something that we touched on earlier. Of course, we look at the priests, some of the religious problems in her reign too, and the men that kept her safe. People like William Cecil and his son Robert, Franz Walsingham. A big part of her success, a big part of her queenship, is Elizabeth not only chose good men, good advisors, but she listened to them. She listened to wise counsel. So that perhaps gives you an idea of what we're covering in the book.
That sounds wonderful, and I absolutely can't wait. So tell us when it's coming out. When can we start looking for it?
Well, it's due to be published in the summer of 2022. It may be that it might not come out in the States till a bit later, because that's what happened with King and Collector. But there are sources here that will send. In fact, I can't remember what the name of it is now. There's one particular company that you can order from, and they'll send it to the States, and it's free shipping. So it will be possible to get it, hopefully in the summer of 2022. But we don't have the exact publishing date yet.
Okay, well, we will all look for that, and I will certainly keep everyone updated on social media, as I'm sure you will, on when that's to come and how those of us in the States can get it, because I know we will want it. So fabulous. So that brings me to tell us where my listeners can find you and learn more about what you're doing and get a hold of you and all those kinds of things. And please, again, tell us about your connection with historic royal palaces and the option, especially at Hampton Court, of your doing the guided tours, because we all are so desperate to get back to England once things open up. So tell us about that and how we can get a hold of you.
Okay, so I've been at Hampton Court for 20 years, and I love showing people around. And if anyone wants a guided tour, the best way to get hold of me is through my website, which is the History Guides. So it's thehistoryguides.com or thehistoryguides.co.uk. And because I share it with some colleagues, and some of whom do walks in London, some are art historians. So we do a few different things that are mentioned on the website. And I'd be delighted if anyone wants to get in touch, and be delighted to show people around Hampton Court Palace.
All right. And I will have links to that on the show notes so you can find that and link and start planning your fun future in these wonderful sites. Well, thank you, Siobhan, so much for bringing the tower and all of its stories to life for us, for helping us remember and understand that it wasn't just a terrible, gloomy place. Although there were some fascinating stories about rebels who were, like John Jarrod, who were also spies and escaping, and just the people who lived there and the animals and the long, rich history of this wonderful place. And for reminding us how exciting all of this history is. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I hope that, I thought I didn't like the Tower of London when I started my training at Hampton Court, but that was because I didn't understand it. It is interesting. It is fascinating. And I hope that if I've done anything, maybe I've inspired someone to want to come back and perhaps look at the tower with fresh eyes.
Oh, that's wonderful. And that would be a great goal for all of us, to look with fresh eyes and see some of the other stories that we might not have heard about yet. So thank you so much for that. Because we really have a better sense of that. And I do appreciate that. And I want to thank everyone for joining us and for listening. And again, all of the information about Siobhan, her other books, she has some wonderful, wonderful books, will be on the show notes. And I will keep you all posted about the book about Elizabeth that's coming the summer of next year. And we'll find some ways for those of us in the States to get it. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you again, Siobhan.
Thank you.
My thanks to Siobhan Clarke for taking us behind the scenes and into the unknown stories of the Tower of London. I hope you've enjoyed our time with rebels and rebellions. Please, if you would, subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating, and think about joining the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics patron family. We would love to have you. In the meanwhile, let's keep shaking up history together.